In the last video, we set up the player and had all the player animations set up for idle, run, jump, and fall. And we were able to set up the events that are going to make the player behave with the animation versus the actual player box itself. So let's take a look again. Is that I'm leaving the player's animation kind of outside the playable area. When the game starts, it'll come and pin itself to the player's box. So our player is able to move, jump, and fall. But right now we've got a basic layout. We have no collectibles or no enemies. So in this video, we're going to set up some different types of enemies to interact with. So the first thing I want to do is insert a new object. So I'm going to right click in the margin. I'm going to insert a new object. It's going to be a sprite object. And I'm going to label this enemy. And I'm going to insert. I'm going to select just above the canvas area. Open this up just a little bit. I'm going to go over to the folder in the upper left hand corner. I'm going to locate my assets, PNG, enemies, and then there's several different types of enemies. The one that they use in the tutorial is the walking enemy. So I'm going to go ahead and insert the walking enemy, but I'm going to look at a couple of these other enemies and add a few extra just to give the level a little bit more spiciness. So I can select these one at a time, or if I know that I want to run through a specific animation, I'm going to want to choose multiple images that make up that particular animation. So the walk has 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to grab this one and the other 2. So I have 3 total. I'm going to upload. I'm going to zoom in so I can see my enemy. I can look at the actual collision box around this enemy. This enemy, for each of these, has a different collider box. Now this could be a problem with running into this specific enemy and the fact that we want to make this enemy walk on the platform. And this one here, now that I'm looking at it, this enemy with the feet that are wider apart, I'm going to disregard this one here. So if you want one that you don't need anymore, right click and then delete. And I'm going to use these two. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take this polygon collider here and I'm going to right click and I'm going to set it to bounding box. And then I'm going to apply to whole animation. So both have that bounding box that's just around outside the body. But the enemy has a curved head on top here. So what happens, the player catches the edge, they may take damage. So what we could do is we could move this in slightly just around, or I could move these independent, or I could even add a point so that I can provide the player with a little bit more flexibility on the collider box. You can go, I think, up to recommended about 8 points before it gets too complicated. And so as this one's going through, I fixed this one, it's not on the other one. So in order for me to use this same polygon shape on the other animation, I need to right click on the polygon that I want to choose and apply to whole animation, and now they both have that same polygon shape. This enemy only has one animation. We could rename this one here and call this the walking enemy, or you can leave it alone. And I'm going to leave the speed alone at 5, and I'm going to go to loop so that it loops through the 2 different frames of animation. This enemy is going to stand on the platform. It's going to walk on the platform there. And right now the image point is set to center. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to double click on my enemy. I'm going to go to the image point tool this time. I'm going to go to origin, right click, quick assign and go to bottom, and then I want that to be on both of them. So if I go right click on Origin again, and then I apply to whole animation, that way both in fact have the new origin point. Because if you leave the origin point alone, let's say the frame number 1, if I accidentally left the origin at the center, once it changes animation frames, your object will look a little funky in the game. It'll start toggling through that, and we don't want that. We want both of the frames to be at the same origin point at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to frame 0, and then I'm going to apply the whole animation again. So they're both set to the bottom. Close out again. I've made some changes, so I'm going to save my work. And now my player can stand, or the enemy, sorry, can stand on the platform. And then I'm going to put the enemy over here. First thing I'm going to do is, with this enemy, it's going to need the same behaviors as the player, the platform behavior. But in this case, if I add the platform behavior to this enemy for walking, which is fine, but if I leave the default controls alone, it'll move with the player. And actually, let's put this next to the player so we can look at this as an example. That if I move to the right, so does the enemy. If I move to the left, so it's moving with me because it's using the same default controls as a player, the arrow keys, therefore it's going to move just like the player. We don't want that. We want it to move on its own with like AI movement. That way it can detect the walls and things like that. So I'm going to want to go to play mode, and on that enemy, I'm going to want to remove these default controls because I don't want that to be the case. I also don't want this enemy moving at the same speed as myself. So for its max speed here, I'm going to tone this down to 50 so that it moves much slower. Now I could go through and change some of the other values here, but this enemy is just going to stay on the platform, moving back and forth, sort of patrolling and preventing the player from getting by on this area itself here. One thing to note is that this enemy has an eyeball that's facing in the right direction, so it's facing the correct way. So for movement, again, right is positive, left will be negative in terms of knowing the sign of movement. This one's already set up, so now we need to know, how does this enemy know which direction it's going to go? That's what these instant variables are for. It's to provide additional data or variables for this enemy, or even the player, like maybe a health value or a collectible value. We can have instant variables that are applied to this instance only on this enemy. So if I go to add an instant variable, we can provide a variable name, a type, and an initial value. So this is going to be a string, and I'm going to use the word right. So the enemy is going to go in the right direction initially based on this value here. I'm sorry, that's going to be the value is going to be right. And we're going to call this action. So that way we need to know which action are we going to apply to the enemy. You can call it movement, direction, things like that. But this is the setup. So name of the variable, the type of variable, and the initial value. So this enemy, I want to go in the right direction, and I'm going to use that value on the default setup. And where that comes into play is in the event sheet. Now, how do I make this enemy move on its own? And also, how do I make sure this enemy doesn't actually fall off and die? We're going to set up a bounding box for this enemy. So the enemy itself is that I'm going to right click and I'm going to insert a new object. This can be a sprite as well. and we could call this wall, and that's going to prevent the enemy from bumping into it. So I'm going to insert, I'm going to click on my canvas, I'm going to go off the image point, and I'm going to choose a color that I can see, so a bright green, go to the paint bucket, and I'm going to click the square. And this is a large square, so I'm going to reset this. Again, the size of the assets that I'm working on, they're 64 by 64. So I have a much better size of this. And then I would put these on both sides of the enemy itself. Now, if this looks too big for you, you can always manually change its size. Maybe instead of going 64 on the width, maybe you want to go down to, say, 24, so it's much thinner profile, and that way that enemy can move a little bit farther before it collides on both sides. And I'll do a control or a command click and drag. I'm going to put one on that side for this enemy to walk back and forth in front of. One thing we want to determine is that if the player does in fact run into the enemy, let's add a flash behavior. And so I'm going to add this flash behavior to the player's animation, not the player, but the animation, what you see when you're playing the game. So I'm going to go to behaviors, I'm going to add a behavior, and I'm going to add that flash behavior. So if the player does run into the enemy, it flashes. Save my work, and let's go to the event sheet. And let's add a new event. And so here, if the player box, and I've noticed that I have my player box is bright green and the wall is bright green, that could be confusing for some people. So I'm going to change that on the next step. We'll make that like red or something like that. So player box, and then I'm going to look for on collision with another object. Well, what object do I want to collide with? I'm going to collide with my enemy. And if I collide with my enemy, I want to make that player animation flash. So I'm going to add action on the player animation. And I'm going to go to flash, and then I'm just going to go ahead and start flashing. Now it has a set period to run through. And this will be 0.1, and duration is 0.1, and it will last for 1 second. Okay, I'm going to save my work. Let's test this out. I'm actually going to go to the wall itself, and I'm going to change that color. So I'm going to go with a red, so it's a little bit easier, different color to see it. Actually, even red is not the best. I'll go with a yellow. There we go. So it kind of stands out there in the design. Play test. Now I can still see the wall in the playable area here, preview. So I'm gonna have to make that invisible just like I did the player box. But if I run into the enemy, I'm now getting that flashing effect. So every time I collide with the enemy, I'm getting that flashing effect. Okay, let's go off. Let's go back to the wall, and I'm gonna scroll down, and we're on the properties here, the initially visible. I'm gonna uncheck that. Save my work, play test again, and I can no longer see those boxes anymore. Now, one thing to do is that let's be able to stomp on this enemy here as well. So I'm on collision with the enemy. But if I'm going to stomp on the enemy, I need to create an additional sub-event that's going to check for that happening. On the margin where this little green arrow is at, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go to Add, and over to Sub-Event. And this sub-event is that I'm going to check for the player box. And I'm looking for, on the platform settings, is the player falling? Is the player falling? And if the player is falling, we want to make sure that the player is in fact above the enemy. So I'm going to add a second condition here. So I'm going to right click, add another condition, and I'm going to check for the player box, and I want to compare its Y. So I want to compare the Y value. Now in Construct, the way the coordinate system works is that 0, 0 is in the upper left-hand corner. So if the player is falling, the values on Y are going down positively, and if they're above, they're going up negatively. So in this case, I still want to be above the enemy's Y position. So I want to check for, and I want to make sure that I am less than my player's box. The Y value needs to be less, so I'm above. And in this case, I want to go with the enemy dot Y value. So the enemy has a Y value and an X value, and we're comparing what is this value at the time that I'm falling. And then done. So once these two, so I do collide with the enemy, and these two conditions are met. If these two conditions are met, I'm going to destroy that enemy. So add action here. On that enemy, scroll down to miscellaneous, and I want to destroy, and that's going to destroy that enemy. Now, here, the player's flashing if I run into the enemy. I don't want that to beat it. I only want to flash if I hit the enemy and I'm not falling. So what I can do is on here, I'm going to add another condition. Another sub-event. And this is going to be the system. This is going to be an else condition. So system, and I'm going to go all the way down towards the bottom for special conditions, else. So if this is true, then this happens. We're checking for this. If this is not true, then else. So this, I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down. So only flash if the player is not falling on collision. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to save my work. Let's go ahead and play test and verify. So I'm going to start moving over. I'm going to jump. If I run into the player, I still flash. But if I jump, then it basically smashes the enemy. But the player kind of still falls. We want to be able to push the player back up a little bit to give the player a little bit of velocity back up. So in this case, if I do smash the enemy, so instead of destroying the enemy first, let's add some velocity to the player box. And so I'm going to go down to, and I want to set the vector Y. Set the vector Y. So again, this is the motion on the Y value. And I'm going to go, this is negative, it's going up. Positives down, negatives up. So I'm going to go negative 500. And let's see what this does. And so I want these run in order. So make sure that you drag this above. So that way it'll push the player back up and then destroy the enemy. So let's save, play test. If I scroll over, jump. So if I'm flashing there, but if I jump and it pushes the player back up just a little bit and then smash the enemy. Now 500 was too or not enough, then change that maybe 700 so you get a better pop on the player. This is the same mechanism that would be in place. Let's say the enemy was a trampoline and you had a trampoline in your game and you wanted to be able to jump on a trampoline or something or a spring, and that you wanted to be able to bounce off something to give yourself a little bit of height, you would use this same action. So in this case, instead of you running into the enemy, maybe you ran into a trampoline or a spring or something and you wanted to get a little bit of pop, the same event sets up where you would then, player is on collision with that object, and on that object, the action would be, in fact, to push the player up in the Y direction. So that's what the mechanism would be to give yourself a little bit of boost if you want to have a spring in your game. But that's not where that goes for now. So that goes down there. Save my work. And then I'm going to verify one more time. If I go ahead and jump on the enemy, smash, and kick myself back up. All right. Last step is that we need to get this enemy moving back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and check that we need to set up that if a specific action value is set up, that we simulate the motion of the enemy. So I'm going to add event, and I'm going to go on the enemy. And I want to compare the instant variable. We created that instant variable on the action. Next, the action is that string equal to the word right? If the variable is set to right, I want to take my enemy and I want to go down a platform and I want to simulate the control. Simulate the control. Next, and I want to go in the right direction. This is the same setup because Construct uses the arrow keys by default. If you wanted to set up and use the WASD keys, this is the same way to simulate the control using those other arrow keys. Food for thought there. And then this enemy is facing right. I want to not mirror as well. So enemy, I want to go to appearance, set mirrored, and I want to go to not mirrored. So I'm not mirroring that enemy. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but in the left direction. So add event on the enemy. I'm going to scroll down to compare instant variable. Next, I want to compare that you put this inside the double quotes. Make sure it's inside the double quotes. And so if the enemy's action is left on the enemy, I want to simulate the control in the left control. And I also want to mirror. So on the enemy, go to mirror, and I want to mirror that enemy. And that's what's going to let the enemy move in the specific direction. But what happens, and we need to actually get the enemy moving on that, because right now by default the enemy will in fact move right. So if I was to save this, and I'm going to put the player right here so we can see this happening. There's the enemy. It starts to go in the right direction, but it hits the wall. We need to tell the event system that if this enemy hits the wall, that we need to turn around. And so this will be the enemy is going to be on collision with that wall. So the enemy is on collision with the wall. And if the enemy is on collision with the wall, we need to know what that variable is. So I'm going to add a sub-event. So right-click, add sub-event. And then I'm going to compare the action. So on the enemy, I want to compare the instant variable. Does the instant variable have the value of right? And if it does, then I want to switch the setup. And so if this is right, then we need to simulate the controls in the opposite direction. So enemy, go down to simulate control. I'm sorry, we need to reassign and set the value, not because we're already simulated the controls. Let's cancel that, back up. Add action on the enemy. We're going to go to set the instant variable. So we're going to set the value on the instant variable. And this is going to be left, because if the player hits the wall, the enemy hits the wall, and the action is right, then we need to set the value of action to left. And then here, it's going to be the opposite, where we're going to do else. Like we did the else condition here, same thing down here. We're going to do the opposite. So right-click, add sub-event on the system. And then you can also search for keywords. I can also search for the word else there as well. And else, then the action, if it's already left, we have to go right. So on the enemy, I'm going to go ahead and set the value to right. And then I'm going to save my work. I'm going to verify that this is working correctly. So there's the enemy walking. It now has turned around. So I'm going to jump over. It's going to hit the wall there, turn around, and look at all, and also pay attention to the eye on the enemy. The eye is facing the right, hits the wall, the eye is facing left. So we've mirrored the character correctly in both directions. Now we're all set up. So the enemy is moving. I can still stomp on it. And there you have it. We now have a walking enemy. I could go through and place a few more. Maybe one up here as well. The walking enemy there as well. And then if you wanted to place one on the lower platform down here. And then one more down there as well. So give myself a few more walking enemies to stomp on. You could go through the process of adding an additional enemy. They did have several ones to choose from, so I wanted to insert new object. Another cool one you can go with, we can go down Sprite. They had one that was flying, so I could do flying and then enemy. And the flying enemy is right here. Check the collision on there. I'm going to leave that one alone for right now, but I'm setting up a different type of enemy. And now I have a flying enemy, and what I could do is, on this particular enemy here, if I go and play test for a moment, so it's going to go through the, the animation is not set up. So double click, make sure you're looping, and I could speed this up a little bit, maybe go 8 on the speed. There's that enemy there. I could slow its wings down again as well, but maybe make it go back and forth. So I could add a behavior, and I could add this sign behavior to the enemy here. And then I'm gonna make this enemy go left and right. So it's got a horizontal movement. The wave is a sine wave. The period is how many seconds to complete a one cycle. So it'll go right, back to center, left, back to center. And the magnitude is how far. If each of these squares is 64, you can times however many you want to get the motion. But for right now, for this little thing here, is I'm gonna have it just kind of go back and forth. And there it is. There's that, and the little flying one kind of going back and forth, back and forth. And you can have it going up and down as well. So I could put this one kind of over here. This one kind of go back and forth. And if I was to make a copy of this and put this one right here, I could actually make this one go vertical up and down, and maybe have it go up one. And maybe its magnitude, I'll go to 60, just a little change. And instead of 4, I'll go to 6. And so now this enemy here is in fact moving up and down a farther distance but slower pace. And there's an enemy there going back and forth. Now, in order for us to kill that enemy, you would have to set up the same mechanisms here in the event system, but that's in case you wanted to add an additional enemy to your game. That's the process. And there you have it. Thanks for watching.